Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. My name is Carson Curad. I'm a first year at the college studying history, and I'm also a member of the JFK Junior Forum Committee here at the Institute of Politics. Before we begin, please take a moment to note the side doors on the park side and the street side of the forum. In the event of an emergency, please walk to the exit closest to you and congregate in the JFK Park. Please also take a moment now to silence your cell phones. And you can also join the action online with the hashtag JFK Junior Forum Live and follow our student-run Instagram at JFK Junior Forum for behind-the-scenes highlights. Please take your seats now and join me in welcoming our guest and IOP Director, Mark Guerin.
Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's forum. We are thrilled to have you here for this important conversation, and we welcome you back at 8 o'clock tonight to watch the debate here tonight. So it's a double header of sorts here. But we are very fortunate to have a distinguished panel here and grateful to our colleague, Professor Khalil Muhammad from the Kennedy School here, who will really engage with our panelists here on this important topic. He teaches race, history, and urban policy here at the Kennedy School and serves as the Young Murray Professor at the Radcliffe Institute. His research and scholarship addresses the intersection of race and democracy and inequality in the criminal justice system. And he is the author of the book, The Condemnation of Blackness, Race, Crime, and the Making of Modern Urban America. And much of his work has been featured in national media outlets, including the New York Times, the Post, the New Yorker, and other important publications. Professor Lizabeth Cohen is the Howard Mumford Jones Professor of American Studies here at Harvard, and she was most recently the Dean of the Radcliffe Institute. In her recent book entitled Saving American Cities, Edward Logue and the Struggle to Renew Urban America in the Suburban Age, in which she examines the benefits and costs of the shifting strategies of rebuilding American cities after World War II. We welcome from Princeton Professor Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor. She joins us from Princeton as an assistant professor in the African American Studies Department. She is the author of From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation. In her third book, entitled Race for Profit, How Banks and the Real Estate Industry Undermine Black Home Ownership. It was published in 2019 and looks at how the federal government's promotion in black communities after the urban rebellions in the 1960s. We welcome you here. And David Williams, a graduate of the college and the law school, is the policy director at Opportunity Insights, which is a research and public policy lab here at Harvard, dedicated to using big data to improve upward mobility in America. And David and his colleagues are tasked with supporting research and evidence-based policy change initiatives and leading to partnerships with communities across the country. So a distinguished panel, a perfect panel to discuss this important topic. We welcome all of you here, and thank you, Khalil.
Well, good evening, everyone, and I am really honored to have colleagues and friends, new colleagues, to be part of this conversation on racism and housing policy. I know that some of you in this room were able to view the exhibit here at the Kennedy School, Undesign the Red Line, curated by We the People and April DeSimone. So you should think of this event as a continuation of the conversations that began with that exhibition. But of course, we know that the pressing issue of affordable housing and the deeply entrenched nature of racial segregation in the United States is very current and timely with respect to our politics and our future. And so we hope out of this conversation that we can make visible where we've been, where we are, and where we might be going. And as a personal commitment to the importance of history and historical literacy, to essentially learn from the past as best we can, I'm hoping that our panelists, in fact, not a hope, I know that they're going to help us pick up some lessons that we've learned. I wanted to do a little context setting before we jump into that history and remind you, at least what many of you might have read in the Spotlight expose on racism in Boston. With respect to the Seaport Project, they write this: imagine a fresh start, a chance for Boston to build a new urban neighborhood of the future, untouched by bigotry of the past. Start with a swath of nearly 1,000 acres whose rotting railroad piers and asphalt parking lots had lain fallow for generations. Invest more than $18 billion in public money to create some of America's most valuable property. Envision a seaside neighborhood that city planners said would be for all of Boston. Of course, Siri has now taken over my screen. In Boston's thriving seaport, the pre-dawn joggers are almost all white. The morning rush of commuters, lawyers, accountants, scientists, and financiers include very few black faces. How white? This white. Lenders have issued only 3 residential mortgages to black buyers in the seaport's main census tracts out of 660 in the past decade. The population is 3% black and 89% white, with a median household income of nearly $133,000, the highest of any Boston zip code, according to recent U.S. Census estimates. And so, if we just move very quickly from Boston to Long Island, the local newspaper there, Newsday, did its own investigative report focused on teams of white and black, white and Asian, and white and Hispanic testers. The federal government does this every 10 years or so, but they wanted to look more closely at that local community. In a 3-year study, they found that 19% of Asians, 39% of Hispanics, and 49% of blacks faced disparate treatment, including income testing, steering, and being shown fewer listings overall. That was published just about 3 months ago. Much more to say about the details of that, but I think you get the point. And so, we're going to start this conversation with acknowledging at least some basics about how did we get here. And in particular, since the Undesigned, the Red Line exhibition was about redlining, we might start with that term for those who are unfamiliar with it or have been waiting for the moment to really unpack it and understand it in ways that are meaningful to our present. And so I'm going to punt that to Keeanga, who's written this amazing book, Race for Profit, and she's going to get us started.
Okay, cool. Again, thank you for the invitation, and happy to be here. So where does the term redlining come from? We have to go back to the 1930s, in the midst of the Depression, when the U.S. government undertakes for the first time a federal housing policies in 1933 and 1934. And so it's important to know that in 1933, half of all mortgages in the United States were in foreclosure. And so part of the initiative of the U.S. government is to both figure out how to stop the crisis of foreclosures, but also, is there a way through housing that the U.S. can begin to address the economic crisis of that period? So, prior to the first federal legislation, 1934, the creation of the Federal Housing Administration, in order to get a mortgage in the U.S., you had to typically put up 50% of the total value of the house, and then you would have 5 to 10 years to pay it back. So home ownership was only open and available to a very small part of the population. So 2 things happen. One is the federal government creates the Homeowners Loan Corporation as a way to help homeowners refinance their loans to stop the wave of foreclosures that are happening. And then the second thing is, through the creation of the Federal Housing Administration, is a plan to expand homeownership massively by changing the terms by which it is available to people. So no longer would you have to put up 50% of the value of the house, and you would get many years, not just 5 or 10 years, but you get 15, 20, 25, and eventually 30 years to pay the loan off. But because there is an interest in protecting the loans and protecting the interest of the banks as a way to get them to participate in this new effort to expand home ownership, the federal government essentially plays the role of insurer. And so one of the ways that they are able to entice the participation of banks is to say that the federal government will insure the mortgages of a much wider group of people so that banks can essentially loan with abandon. They don't have to worry about defaults or foreclosures, because if someone is in that position, the federal government will now step in to pay off the loan. But there are conditions. There are 2 primary conditions. One is that in order to be eligible for this new mortgage loan insurance, the properties need to be new. And so that immediately raises a question about properties in urban areas, which are overwhelmingly old and in proximity to industry, and perhaps not in a position to accrue in value in the same way as a new property would. And second, the person receiving the loan would need to be a part of a racially homogeneous area, meaning essentially that if these properties were to be new, which was translated as suburban, and racially homogeneous, which was translated as white, that would create the criteria for eligibility for these loans. And you know, this was not just this wasn't hearsay. This was when the federal government creates underwriting criteria for who is eligible for loans. It makes clear that the introduction of a person who would disrupt the racial homogeneity of a neighborhood would make a loan not worthy of being insured. And so part of this, I think, an understanding, like where does this logic come from, is to understand the relationship between the private sector and the public sector. So the real estate industry and the federal government. I think as in most endeavors, when the federal government undertakes new projects, they make the claim to go and consult with experts to get best practices in order to do so. So in housing, that is the real estate industry, whether it is mortgage lenders or whether it is real estate brokers. And so as early as 1924, the National Association of Real Estate Boards had already made it a rule that any realtor who introduced someone of a different race into a racially homogeneous neighborhood would lose their license. They would lose their right and ability to practice real estate. So these are the people who are recruited into Roosevelt's Federal Housing Administration to help shape the first federal laws regarding housing policy and home ownership in particular. And so they bring with them their expertise in segregation. They bring with them their expertise in the racial marginalization of non-white people. And it's pretty intense. I mean, this is the heyday of eugenic thinking. The Homer Hoyt, who was instrumental in shaping FHA policy, had come from the ranks of the real estate industry in Chicago, and he actually had a list ranking races in order in terms of their deleterious impact on property values, with African Americans and Mexicans making up the two groups determined to have the most negative impact on property values. And so that is also important in terms of understanding what is at the heart of the new FHA, Federal Housing Administration's policy making, which is the protection of property values. It essentially assumes the identity of a conservative insurance agency that is not necessarily interested in protecting the buyer, the home buyer, but is interested in protecting the loan of the lender. It is the loan that is insured, not the actual homeowner. And so the FHA, in part of determining who will be eligible for insurance, relies on maps that had been created by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, the organization that had been instrumental in determining how to refinance loans that were in potential of going in foreclosure. And they made that determination not necessarily on race, even though that was a consideration, but on what they considered to be the viability of the loan. And they used color-coded maps to determine that, with I think blue being the best case scenario, a loan that would absolutely be refinanced. Green, maybe some questions, but more than likely a positive candidate for refinancing. Yellow, a lot more questions, much more interrogation of that particular property, but still not an impossibility. And red, grade D, was the designation by which there was no possibility of having a loan that was located in that area refinanced. And so this became part of how the FHA would also determine who would be eligible for mortgage insurance. And as a result of where African Americans were migrating into, which were urban areas, most of which were marked D, color-coded red, black people would become ineligible, and white people who lived in proximity to black people in the red areas would also become ineligible. And this is just some of the history that gives us the framework of redlining.
Thank you very much, Keeanga. So one way to think about it in the biggest terms, from the 1930s up till about the 1950s and 60s, this state sanctioned racist practice of redlining, because it moves from private industry to public policy, shapes the geography of metropolitan cities. And one of the things that I know is really important to Keeanga's new work, and what Liz is going to talk about in just a moment, is the appellation of low income or affordable housing. In our mind's eye, just like in actuarial terms around risk, often evokes poor people, and poor people of color, and black people in particular. But in fact, this is 3 or 4 decades of low-income housing. She starts with an explanation that most homes, single-family homes, are not affordable for the average working American. And so the very policy put in place that is based on whiteness as the precondition is about being low income or not able to afford a decent home, which then becomes the primary wealth instrument for America's white middle classes. Okay, so Liz, so then we get this racial liberal who's got big ideas. Tell us about it.
So thank you, Keeanga. That was an incredibly precise and helpful summary of redlining that she gave you. And I'm going to try to suggest to you some of the challenges that the legacy of that history presented to somebody who did try to make some changes in the post-World War II period. So you heard that I just published this book called Saving America's Cities, Ed Logue and the Struggle to Renew Urban America in the Suburban Age. And the book really uses the career of a man who worked in this area of urban redevelopment, urban renewal from the early 1950s until his death in 2000. And he's useful to me as my vehicle not only because he had a long career, but that he worked in many different places. He was in New Haven in the 1950s. He came to Boston in the 1960s. He moved on to New York State, heading something called the Urban Development Corporation from the late 1960s to the mid-1970s. And his last major job was in the South Bronx. And so he's helpful because of that spatial move, but also because he was working within regimes that kept changing. Yes, the redlining paradigm persists, and that's what's so important in Keeanga-'s work, to see the ways in which it morphs but persists. But also, there are changes that take place. And so someone like Logue, who did consider himself to be a racial liberal, he had his many flaws. He was a very complicated character. I tried to convey that in the book. But he did, throughout this long career, try to create mixed income and mixed racial communities. And that was indeed a challenge. And so looking at, I want to sort of share with you some of the lessons that could be drawn from the struggles that he went through to try to do this over his career and see where that gets us. His own, just to say that he made many mistakes, but he did live through some major changes. I don't think that urban renewal and urban redevelopment should be just viewed as one static thing from 1949, the Housing Act, all the way till today. I think it changed, and I try to chart that. But in the 1950s, in places everywhere, pretty much, urban renewal was demolition. And the point I want to make here is that that was baked into the 1949 Housing Act. It's another example of what Keeanga gave you, where the way in which these resources that were made available to cities struggling to cope with massive suburbanization, as you heard why. We had a housing shortage after the Depression and the war and so forth, and that's where people were getting mortgages. So that the tools that an urban redeveloper had baked into it, as I said, then the need to demolish and then to build anew. In the 1954 Act, that changed. Rehabilitation became possible. By the end, later on in Logue's career, this is sort of one of the arcs, he learns that to avoid those kinds of problems, when he moves to New York State, he looks for opportunities to build on undeveloped land. So, for example, the Urban Development Corporation develops new towns, two in upstate New York and Roosevelt Island in the East River. Most of you have been to New York, you may very well know it. Another change that he comes to accept, not necessarily voluntarily, but it becomes a reality, and he really much, by the end of his career, I argue, he kind of embraces it, is that there is really a need to change how an urban renewer conceives of community engagement. He starts off in New Haven having representatives from established organizations, elites, basically. In living through the 1960s, where communities really push back, communities get mobilized, he really comes to recognize that if he's going to accomplish any of the things he wants to, he has to really work much more closely with those communities. And the major change that he has to cope with is a shift from the government taking some responsibility, as flawed as it was, but making some resources available to a regime that really starts in the 1970s. You could even say it starts in the late 60s. Nixon really feeds it. Carter doesn't do things much differently. Reagan really goes and runs with it, which is turning the provision of any subsidized or affordable housing over to the private sector. And so that's kind of the arc of what he has to go through. Now, some of the things that in addition to the fact that much of the constraints are built into this legislation, I just wanted to mention a few other things that I learned in my own work that I think may have some relevance. One is that there is diversity within racial communities. And I saw that in New Haven in the 1950s. Interestingly, many of the established black organizations, the NAACP, CORE, actually supported these efforts to redevelop in the hopes that they would create integrated communities. There was very limited housing options in New Haven. African Americans were moving from the south to the north. They're hoping for more opportunities. And there was a desire to have integrated communities where African Americans would have the benefits of the better services, schools, transit, retail that whites had. That became very difficult to deliver. They tried to put infill housing into white neighborhoods. You can imagine how well that went over. They tried a variety of other things. That it became very difficult to do that. By the 1960s, activists in the black community who were generationally younger basically said, we want the resources. We don't want to live where white people don't want us, but we want to say, and we want those resources in our communities. When Logue moved on to Boston, interestingly, the community that most welcomed his arrival was the middle-class black community of Washington Park and Roxbury. That was the only neighborhood in Boston where black middle-class people could buy homes. And they had inherited it from a Jewish community. There still were Jews there, but they were moving to the suburbs. And they were feeling like they wanted to preserve this community, their property values, and they saw that a lot of lower income blacks were being sort of dumped into their neighborhood as the South End gentrified and other things were happening. And so they really did welcome him and an expanded BRA into the neighborhood. Some of the struggles that Logue was up against included recognizing how when these people wanted to invest in their homes and get they got small grants from the government to do renovations, but if they were going to be more ambitious than that, they needed bank loans. He was very aware of the redlining problem. He worked with the FHA, got them to relent some. He helped create a consortium of 21 banks and thrift institutions to basically lend in certain neighborhoods where they had not lent before. But after he left in 1968, what we call BBERG, Boston Bank's Urban Renewal Group, completely shifted the strategy. And rather than say, okay, we will loan in those neighborhoods, those became the only neighborhoods that they would lend in. So basically, they redlined those neighborhoods, led to white flight, and so forth. And I could tell you, stories of other communities. Charlestown basically makes a deal. It will take urban renewal in exchange for not having any more than the few blacks who lived in the public housing that was in Charlestown, which was segregated at the time. I know there's not a lot of time here. Let me just point to one of the I think another important experience that Logue had, which was when he moved to New York State. He had tried throughout his career to create metropolitan solutions to urban problems. He felt that was part of this redlining problem, that blacks would be isolated in the city, whites would move to the suburbs. He was unsuccessful in New Haven, unsuccessful in Boston. When he had a statewide position in New York State, he thought, now I can finally make this happen. And one of the powers that the Urban Development Corporation was given, which made it extremely controversial and pretty much hated by state legislators, and it was Rockefeller who really pushed it through, one of its powers was the ability to override local zoning. And local zoning, of course, is what had kept out any subsidized housing in most suburbs. So he launches in the early 1970s what he calls a fair share housing program to build small amounts, 100 units, of subsidized housing in 9 wealthy Westchester communities. Well, that did not go over very well. He fought very hard for it, and they had that. It basically led to the pushback led to basically the demise of the Urban Development Corporation and the power to override local zoning, which has been the barrier to so much that we want to see happen, was taken away from the UDC, and ultimately, there's much to say here, but part of the way that the Urban Development Corporation was funded was through loans, bonds and loans from private investors. There was very little federal money left by the late 1960s and 70s. There was some state money from New York State, but they had this idea that they could get investors from the private sector and that would make resource available. Well, the other thing that happened is that bankers basically decided in a fiscal crisis in New York State, New York City, that the UDC had a lot of responsibility for this and that it was putting its social mission before its responsibility to its investors. And I'll just close with, there's much more to say, but I don't want to take up all the time. But I'll just close with a quote from Logue. He obviously lost his job. The UDC ultimately was done for. And this was the quote I'll read you. "It was too good to last, and that's why I so cordially dislike bankers. They feel threatened that I was engaged in," bankers actually said this, "social engineering, as if that's a mortal sin. I was very proud of the fact that Roosevelt Island was a total piece of social engineering." And it did have mixed income housing, there was market rate, there was heavily subsidized, and so forth. So it just gives you the story of Ed Logue. You can read the book and get more of the details, because I haven't even told you about the South Bronx piece, which is quite interesting. But the difficulty, the point is, even if he was a man with flaws, but he did have certain commitments. And the point here is the difficulty of working within a system that by the time he was working, he was in the South Bronx, he really had to try to make a private sector regime work. And that was extremely difficult.
So we are going to open up at 6:45 because I got to get David in here because he's got all the solutions to this terrible record here. But I want Keeanga to introduce a concept in her new book, Race for Profit, that she has coined predatory inclusion, because it's very much about the increasing role of the private sector beginning in 1968 after the Fair Housing Act is passed. And so just to set you up, because this term social engineering is very much in our zeitgeist through the prism of socialism. And this terrible concept. So William Levitt, who was the largest developer in the United States, according to Keeanga's quote here, has this to say. He created 17,000 units in Levittown, which in many ways is archetypal of the very process of suburbanization through government funding. And he infamously said, quote, "We are 100% dependent on the government. Whether this is right or wrong, it is a fact." And so the resistance to social engineering just happens to coincide with the end of the civil rights movement. The floor is yours, Keeanga.
Okay, so I talk about my book, Race for Profit, is really an effort to look at the transition from redlining and the exclusion of African Americans to their inclusion into the conventional real estate market, to conventional mortgage banking. And I call that process of inclusion predatory inclusion. And so part of it is a way of understanding, particularly in the realm of housing, the relationship between the past and the contemporary moment that is happening in the late 1960s. And I say that because when the Fair Housing Act is passed in 1968, it is taken in such a way as to think that, well, if we just remove racial discrimination from the law, if we stop allowing for this, then we can start from this moment and move forward. So there's actually no effort to repair the past. There's no effort to undo the damage that is done through decades of disinvestment in Black communities because of redlining. And I think it's important to say that it's not only that African Americans are excluded from conventional mortgages, but it's all that comes with that. Black people are also excluded from small home improvement loans, which white families are able to use to maintain their properties, to maintain the value in their properties. And because of the hysteria around maintaining property values, and why is that? Because we live in a country where nothing is guaranteed to you. You don't have a right to food, to education. You don't have a right to health care. You don't have a right to anything. And so your personal ability to accumulate wealth is what determines the quality of your life. And the house is the main way to do this. And this is what has driven the hysteria around property values in the United States over the course of the 20th and now the 21st century. This is the foundation of white mobs and terroristic levels of violence to keep black people in place. So all of this is a product of redlining. And it means that in black communities there is overcrowding, there is dilapidated properties, substandard properties. Cities make a calculated decision to restrict public services. So there's less trash pickup, all these sorts of things, which leads to a proliferation of rats and rat infestation in urban areas. And so to not attend to any of that has been created through through government policy, and simply say in 1968, well, housing discrimination is now illegal, let's all move forward, was irresponsible. And in fact, the degradation that had occurred in black communities, the physical deterioration of black housing, the physical deterioration of black communities as a result of the disinvestment, not just with real estate, but all that, if the federal government says that we're not doing business here, then a lot of other organizations, both public and private, take that as a cue. So there are many different levels of disinvestment that are happening. And the result of that becomes the new evidence, the new excuse for private sector institutions in the post-redlining area to treat black residents different. These become the visual evidence for designating some neighborhoods and some people as subprime. And so I'm interested in showing through predatory inclusion that African Americans were included, but it was on different terms. It was on more expensive terms. It was on the terms of higher interest rates. It was on the terms of more expensive loans. These were the basis upon which black people could be included. And so in doing that, I look at the passage of the Housing and Urban Development Act of 1968, which is a huge omnibus bill, but at its core is a low-income homeownership program that is intended to transform black renters into homeowners. And there are different components to the legislation, but one of the things that is happening is that it is at this moment of transition away from complete federal control and oversight of its housing programs to a much sharper pivot towards the private sector. Lyndon Johnson recruits one of his many commissions. This one in particular is the Kaiser Commission, which was really a commission of business people connected to housing that were tasked with really coming up with a framework for how this program, for how a program like this would work. And Johnson is motivated to create a program that does not require necessarily a new federal bureaucracy, that does not require new public money. Public housing has become politically fraught. And so using a program that is much more dependent on the private sector becomes favorable. As you know, he's constrained by the growing cost of the Vietnam War, and is very concerned politically about the impact of deficits. And so a program that is much more dependent on the private sector, that does not have big upfront costs, becomes attractive. But in doing so, it really misses the way that the question of, can the real estate industry, in particular, the industry that is most responsible for the urban housing crisis, an industry that throughout its history, through the 20th century, has never had a single period of time where it has not relied on racial discrimination, racial logic, in determining property values and all these things, that has been at the core of its business practice. Are these the private institutions, the private organizations that the federal government should be partnering with to solve what is essentially an urban housing crisis? And the result of that is the unraveling of these programs that are created through the Housing and Urban Development Act in 1968. Through the early 1970s, there's a foreclosure crisis. There is exposed all kinds of fraudulent activity, criminal activity, conspiracy to commit criminal activity that involves webs of mortgage bankers, FHA loan appraisers, home appraisers, and other public and private agents who essentially collude around a small section of this program to take advantage of poor and working class African Americans, especially black women who were desperate for housing and who use that as a way to ingratiate and enrich themselves.
Excellent. All right, so we're going to do a little bit of rapid here.
Yeah.
Just to signal, 2 years after that program, as Keeanga is describing, George Romney, HUD secretary, is sidelined by Nixon and John Ehrlichman in a really key chapter in the book, in the middle of the book. And so that's the moment, the moment of pivot between the possibilities for the federal government to redress this past and the unraveling of it. And it basically turns on the federal government is not going to force integration on white people. Right. So how are you going to force integration on white people with creating moves to opportunity?
So one quick point, it's exciting to be here for me, in part because I think there oftentimes aren't the spaces to really talk critically around history and then try and think, how do we use that to inform real, thoughtful policymaking? And then two, I secretly do have all the answers. However, I only have 3 minutes, so you'll have to read my future book. I don't have a name for it yet, but I'll include all of it there. Yeah. In 6 minutes? Okay, interesting.
Two historians who just
We
wrote
give you time.
Yeah. But so I think kind of a few takeaways are, like, one, policy is really hard, right? And I think even the examples of extremely thoughtful people who have the best of intentions, who have real power, even doing the right thing can be very, very difficult. So in a former life, I was an affordable housing attorney. So working on building affordable housing with developers, municipalities, financiers. And so, you know, it's not enough, but our government spends billions of dollars every year on affordable housing, right? Through the low-income housing tax credit, through housing choice vouchers, right? Providing families housing stability, building new affordable housing, providing and helping revitalize neighborhoods in general. But the vast majority of families who benefit from those programs live in high poverty places. And I think a lot of the work that my colleague Raj Shetty has done has kind of not just look at these patterns, but look at the real causal impact of neighborhoods, right? So it isn't just that in theory we think that segregation's bad, but it has real long-term impacts on the families and kids who grow up in these places, right? There's a real causal impact of neighborhoods that he's shown through his research using big data. But it's interesting, though, that these programs and policy we have that are very important are in some ways almost perpetuating this pattern of segregation that we've seen throughout history, even though, you know, there are thousands of very well-intentioned people, including myself, who worked on these deals, who were trying to use these programs to help rebuild our neighborhoods. And And so kind of with some of these insights from the data, thinking around now that we can pinpoint these places that do seem to have better outcomes for low-income kids, kind of revisiting these same questions of what are the causes of segregation, both in terms of race and economic status in our cities. And it's interesting, I think, even despite all the history of how we got here in the first place, I think there's still that conversation in many fields around, so why do people live in these places? Like maybe it was caused by these patterns in the first place, but heck, maybe if you are a black family, you don't want to move to the suburbs and be surrounded by white families, right? If you're a Hispanic family, you want to be in a community that speaks Spanish, right? And so kind of from that researcher perspective, actually saying, so what's causing this today? Is it about preferences? Is it about barriers in the housing market? We worked with a few housing authorities to actually test out.
Is that really an open question for you all? I mean, is that question? It's one thing to imagine an infinite set of possibilities for why people end up where they are. It's another thing to make it an open-ended question in how you design the intervention.
So I think there's two sides to it. So I think you will hear from folks, either folks who work with housing authorities who say, hey, like, I want to invest in this community, right? There has been 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 years of disinvestment. Our money should be going in this place. And actually, I think people prefer to be in this place, but they haven't had the resources to build that community up. And again, I think even with like the idea of like straying into the Black Power movement, right? I don't want to move somewhere else. I want opportunity here. And so again, I think there's a lot of, it's a question of the kind of what happens because of policy, either intended or not intended. So I think that is out there, but I think the other side of it is are the investments we're making in place, are they transforming places in the ways that we want them to be? But also in some respects, are they also reifying these same patterns that I think have caused these disparities in the first place? So I think you kind of get both sides of that, but I think interrogating those questions, I think is really important to understand, well-intentioned or not, what are the implications of the policy choices we're actually making? So I think kind of the research question helps frame that discussion. And so what we saw was that we basically worked with housing authorities, provided a suite of services to help families coming off the wait list for Section 8 housing. Said, hey, we'll give you a housing counselor, we'll engage with landlords, we'll give you the education around some of these neighborhoods that you might not be as familiar with, and help provide the resources to help you move to those places if you want to. And I think something we saw, given that we did a randomized trial, was that those families who received those additional services, they were 4 times more likely to move to these higher opportunity places, right? So I think it does kind of add more evidence that there are still barriers, right? It isn't just about preferences now, but like there are things in the housing market that are still causing these patterns, but that there are ways to overcome some of these challenges, right? This is not going to solve the entire issue. Most families who qualify for Section 8 still don't receive those vouchers because there's no funding for it. But I think there's something about actually providing services that can help navigate some of the systemic barriers that we've seen because of our history. I think that does give some kind of optimism moving forward. And it's something that I think, given the privatization of a lot of these programs, I think is problematic in many ways, but in some ways, programs like this are actually able to get some bipartisan support. And I think especially seeing them as not just as an entitlement, something like Section 8, but actually is a means to help move kids out of poverty, has been an interesting framing that I think has helped programs like this get some additional traction in ways that other investments haven't been able to get. So I think and I think one thing that I found interesting in the work as well is that, and we're doing a phase 2 of the work to figure out like what of the intervention was most impactful for the families. I think something we're seeing is that having that housing counselor to walk families through the process and to really kind of focus on their individual needs seemed to be what made this successful, right? So some families that maybe they need $1,000 to help with moving expenses. Maybe some families, they just had no idea about these places and just the information alone was super helpful. Maybe some families need to actually have support to have those conversations with landlords. I think being able to kind of target each family's individual need seemed to be super helpful. Because you can imagine, right, maybe you're an African-American family, you have no idea about some of these neighborhoods, you're nervous because you might assume rightly that lots of landlords probably don't feel great about someone who looks like you or who's using a voucher. But if you can have a counselor who can actually maybe pre-screen some of these landlords and say, hey, actually, these 2 landlords, they're open to you coming to have a conversation, I think it can help overcome some of those barriers that I think we see in the private market. So again, I think it provides kind of some small points of optimism to see that there are things that seem to be able to overcome some of the barriers that we're seeing in the market, maybe adding one tool in this kind of much broader toolkit that we'll need to expand if we really want to make real impact in the housing market.
So I know Liz has a follow-up question. I'm going to let you go. Floor is open. They're going to kick us off the stage shortly, so go to a mic, please, and I'll just take a cue.
I wanted to just ask you a follow-up question on the Section 8 vouchers. You know, granted, not everybody would want to do this, but many people do. There aren't enough vouchers, we know. You talked about the counseling, which seemed, until the very last comment there, to be oriented around guiding the voucher user. And I would like to know what you are learning about some of the problems of vouchers. As I view them as a private sector strategy, in that it is voluntary. It's the landlord has a choice of whether to accept it or not. And what we have seen in many cities is that people end up in, kind of a second ring ghetto, because those are the only places that the landlord will accept. So is it having any impact on landlords to have this third party who is kind of mediating?
So I think it looks like it is, right? So the families who don't receive those additional services, 10% move to these higher opportunity places, versus over 60% who receive those services seem to move to these neighborhoods. And I think my sense is that there's lots of good landlords, there's lots of bad landlords. And I think one interesting thing is, I think part of the engagement with them is to kind of break down the stereotypes around these families who use vouchers, but also landlords don't like bureaucracy. And I worked in city government for a long time. I understand that skepticism, right? To have to go through rounds of inspections, have to wait longer to actually be able to sign your lease. Those are real things. And that's actually what we probably hear more from landlords. They're probably not going to admit that they don't want to take X or Y family, but I think there is something to the red tape that these programs also have. So part of it was breaking down that red tape also. And I think, again, you're going to have your bad landlords, you're going to have your good landlords. I think if you can have someone who can pave the way to help families find those good ones, it looks like there are available units in these neighborhoods that families might want to move to. So again, I think even a broader lesson too is just service delivery overall. Right? I think a lot of programs were designed, or at least unintentionally, aren't easy to navigate. Right? I think they're important resources that do a lot of good, but it's hard to actually use them in an effective way. And I think this is one example of helping bridge that gap between, I think, the ideal use of the program and helping families navigate that to the ideal as well.
Yes?
Thank you for your presentation. It's most informative. My name is Marcie Hannah. My father was mayor of the capital of Michigan 55 years ago. I did my Harvard doctoral work on the Boston school desegregation case. And afterwards, my mentors were part of the creation of HUD. I have here the report to the president by the Task Force on Metropolitan and Urban Problems. That was a task force headed by Bob Wood, an old colleague friend of mine. And on that committee were others, Paul Ovisacker, my doctoral advisor, and many others who literally created HUD. Bob went on, he also created model cities. There were many mistakes made during that period, but what my question is, and it's really an invitation and a plea, how might we learn from the mistakes that were made? And I think the point about Metro is really important to pick up again, because we're dealing now with issues of zoning in Massachusetts that is really getting in the way of affordable housing. Bob and Paul came from that legion of urbanists in the 50s who were all about Metro, but they got slammed for that for the very reasons that you describe. The second part is, how might we rethink what these quote-unquote sectors are or not. My sense is, and I've worked in this field for 36 years, that we are limiting ourselves by thinking only of public and private partnerships, when the truth is that there are real blurry boundaries between the two. My focus is on billions of dollars in the portfolios of tax-exempt institutions. Those are civil society players that could be doing a lot more with their dough, occupy a lawless zone at the moment, but could put much more into community development, financial institutions, and other kinds of vehicles that keep the money on the ground and help to build equity culture where racism is tackled directly, but not by the same players or through the same solutions.
Thank you. And just for the record, we have 3 more people at the mics, and the mics are closed with those 3 more people. So thank you.
I'll say 2 quick things. One, I think the central problem with HUD and HUD's creation was the idea that the federal government should be deferent to the private sector, and that is written into its original purpose. The federal government envisions its role as assisting the private sector in producing the housing that is necessary for the country. And so part of my work is about the problems with that approach when the real estate industry, and that is the private sector that is being referenced, is so completely enmeshed in perpetuating a housing crisis because of its insistence on the segregation of African Americans. And so there's a point in time when Black people are seen as unfit across the board for home ownership. That begins to change with the 1954 Housing Act. The first experimental program for home ownership in the Renewal areas opens up. And so that opens up the first opportunities for FHA-backed home ownership for Black people. And that becomes more expansive, but on the condition that Black people remain segregated. And this is the logic of the real estate industry and the sacrosanct preservation of property values. The second thing that I would say in relationship to that is that we have to reclaim, I believe, the language of entitlement, the value of government oversight, management, and control. And the main reason for that is not a morality play about the role of government, but because of the scale. The scale of the housing crisis in this country is so profound that little boutique programs that are initiated by through public-private partnerships or by the private sector of we'll do 100 units here, we'll do 17 here, you know, in the most outlandish case, maybe we'll do a few hundred over here, is completely inconsequential to the depth of the housing crisis in this country. And in order to actually match the scale of the crisis, we have to embrace the language of entitlement and the idea that the state has a role to play and that we cannot defer that responsibility to a real estate industry, to a banking industry whose entire history is wound up in white supremacy and racial discrimination that have created these problems that we are living with now.
I know you want to get on that.
All right.
Maybe on the next question.
All right.
Yes.
Thank you for presenting. My name is Harris Taman. I work for a nonprofit developer of affordable housing that primarily uses tax credits. And I was interested if your research touches on the post-1986 era after the low-income housing tax credit came into place. How do we think about racism in urban housing in that regime? I think I have an idea of where your thinking might lie and thinking about private developers having the ability and the mandate really to produce all the affordable housing in the country, but just any context I could take back to our workplace.
No.
Liz is going to jump
I'll
in
just
on it.
say, I mean, tax credits are another part of this, you know, kind of privatized regime. And, you know, again, they are providing the means to build a lot of affordable, the extent to which we're building affordable housing. So it certainly has had its benefits. You know, the problem I have with it is that it kind of, the willingness of corporations to engage and embrace that tax shelter depends on their need for it. And so when you have a tax cut like we just had and that included a lot of corporate tax cuts, one wonders what the impact will be. That, we're again doing very much the same thing that Keeanga told us, is just making sure that the risk is not taken by those private sector investors. Can I just say one thing back to the other question? Was very good. You made a lot of good points. I just wanted to mention that one of the things that Logue tried to do in the 1950s was to get labor unions to another kind of these kind of in-between organizations to invest in housing. And in the 50s, labor unions were a lot more powerful than they are today. Even the UAW, which was really on the more to the left than a lot of other unions, and it didn't really go anywhere. There was a little bit. There were UAW. And there has been an AFL-CIO housing strategy, but it just is a drop in that bucket that we're talking about.
Thanks. Yes.
Hello, my name's Katerina Ranka. I'm a joint degree candidate in international relations at Harvard Extension School. And my question is, in areas that are disinvested and that are rapidly gentrifying due to the spigot of investment coming into a community, how do we potentially control for that spigot of investment to include everyone and be inclusive of minorities, and also encourage minority-owned businesses to prosper in those communities to create jobs locally?
Yeah, no, that's a great question.
$1 million question, right?
Again, so I'll come to start from the optimistic perspective, right? So, I'm trying. So I worked in Detroit. I'm from Detroit. I worked in the mayor's office there, and kind of all of our work was around neighborhood revitalization. And so we actually, in a kind of a funny way, we were almost like the precursor to creating Moose Opportunity, right? Like 200,000 people left Detroit over the past 15 years because they didn't want to live there, right? So it was actually our job to how do we stabilize our communities and actually bring those middle-class families back into the city to build a tax base and create more integrated communities in general. I think Detroit's an interesting case because we literally have the space for everyone, right? Like there are tens of thousands of abandoned houses still, despite like a lot of hard work over the past 10 years to remedy that. But even then, when you see any new development, there's still a lot of skepticism, right? Because people have been promised things for decades and they haven't seen it benefit them, right? So even when there's maybe a new mixed income development that has affordable housing along with market rate development, I think the thought still is, I've been here for 10, 20 years, I'm seeing all this new growth, like yes, it's probably marginally better for me, but these other folks seem to be really reaping the benefit of it. So even when you have, let's just say, an objectively good thing happening, there's still this mistrust that I think you can only, really remedy by actually creating trust, engaging with the community, and actually showing real results. I think on the more macro scale, when you have places like New York, San Francisco, places that are really gentrifying in ways where it's pretty clear folks are being displaced, I think it's an issue of resources, right? I think you're not, and also I think just with how powerful capital is in this country, you have to be very proactive and say we are going to preserve and protect affordable housing because we plan on successfully bringing back people into the community. So I think, again, my optimistic side says that that's actually the place where we can create integrated communities. I'm not sure, or I'm pretty sure we aren't necessarily investing the resources to do that. But I think the flip side of it is there are places like your New Yorks, like your San Francisco that are changing in these ways. There's a lot of places that actually need some sort of investment and infusion, right? I think the majority of places that are struggling, gentrification might happen in 30, 40 years, but I think you do want to create a more mix of incomes and have more resources locally. So I think at the end of the day, it's an opportunity that I think we should take advantage of. It's a question of, is there the political will and the ability to actually resource in these places to protect and preserve affordable housing while attracting new folks to build mixed income communities.
Can I just say really quickly, I'll just preface this by saying I teach policy at Princeton, but I think, not everything is driven by a policy initiative. And I think part of what I mean by that is, I think part of the discussion is about the role of grassroots organizing and social movements, because the linchpin, the political will is often what has been missing in many of these localities, and that is a very complicated history in and of itself. That has to do with the federal government's disinvestment of cities, and that cities have been reduced to the quote unquote growth machine, where they are out looking for resources, for high-end taxpayers, for rises in property taxes, to be able to function as a city itself, and that often puts it in a combative position with its poorer and working class populations, and so that is often where the political will falls apart, and that is where social movements and grassroots organizing comes in to create the political will through the creation of political consequences for the failure to look at the conditions and the situations of poor and working class people.
And I'd just like to add that pressure, I think, needs to ultimately, this may seem like a dream today, but ultimately government has been the problem. We've certainly shared that tonight, but I personally think it is ultimately the only solution. And so part of this story you're telling of cities who are not only are they in a position of squeezing whatever resources they can get out of the private sectors, they're competing with each other. It's a race to the bottom. Who can get Amazon? Who can get GE? Who can get, and it just completely skews priorities. So I see, we have to somehow get to a situation where we get enough pressure put on the federal government. It's the only, I think, counterbalance to a very powerful capitalist private sector.
And I'm going to take this last question, but I want to say this because it hasn't been said, and it's one of the great insights of Keeanga's work, and that is that as long as people convince themselves to one degree or another, either because they're renters and borrowers within segregated, all-inclusive minority communities want to live there, or others in the policy-making circles believe that this is in their best interests, whether they believe it or not. One of the key insights of her work, and only the federal government can fix this, is you essentially have a captured market. And when you have a captured market, no matter how many creative public-private programs are intended to help that market, they will be subject to all sorts of usurious and predatory schemes, because they are not subject, in our free market economy, they're not subject to market dynamics. They can't literally move to other places because there are forces keeping them from being in those other places. And that's why the failure of integration vis-a-vis Nixon's retreat from the Fair Housing Act is the legacy. And so all we're doing essentially is working at the margins of a problem to improve a core problem that economically doesn't make any sense. So even if black people and brown people wanted to live together in an all-inclusive, segregated neighborhood, it's not in our collective economic interest, because even by our own capitalist notions, they're not subject to traditional market forces. Right. So, last question.
Hello, I'm Kevin. I'm a student at MIT. So in some way, the historical problem, anti-black racism in the US, right, of which racism in urban housing urban housing policy is a very large subset, right, has been resolved in the most politically conservative way possible, right? And part of this is due to the post-1960s economic downturn, right, where real incomes have declined for the American working class as much as 40%, and labor union decimation and the naturalization and not the overcoming of the supposed black and working class divide, as exemplified maybe by the New York teacher strike of 1968. And so in light of this, what were the missed political opportunities in the late 1960s and the early 1970s to address the sort of issue of sort of racism in urban housing policy, such that history didn't need to turn out so conservatively? Perhaps whether it be from the perspective of the social movements, whether from the view of social movements Professor Taylor mentions, like the New Left, or otherwise.
That was a good summary
Yeah,
of a lot of
good
what was
question.
discussed here, and in
Right.
some ways recapitulates ideas that have already been expressed. So maybe we'll take that as an invitation, as a final thought on what to make of what happened in the 60s and 70s.
Well, one thing I would say is that what happens in the 1970s that's responsible for a lot of the kind of loss of status and earnings of working class people and the sort of growing weaknesses of their unions, comes from deindustrialization, and that process might have been managed in a different way had the political sort of terrain been somewhat differently. I mean, it's hard for historians to go back and say what if, counterfactuals. But, we could say, had unions been more powerful, had there not been so much incentive to corporations to go offshore and contribute to greater deindustrialization. Had there been somebody other than Nixon and Ford sitting in the White House when New York City faced fiscal crises, there's so many things that might have been different. I personally think that we were on a very bad path, but that we shouldn't forget how detrimental the Reagan administration was and how much it worsened a lot of these conditions. The housing budget was just slashed under Reagan, more than any other part of the Reagan budget. So, these different, even though we are sitting here and condemning a broad trend over the post-war period, there are important differences, I would say, between administrations, and there are still choices within a paradigm that we might not desire, but there are possibilities and difficulties that different administrations negotiate in different ways.
One quick thing that I would say, just almost narrowly, that I think has contemporary implications, which is the failure of HUD to really take racism and racial discrimination in housing seriously. And I say that even after the passage of the Fair Housing Act, what that did was create a civil rights division within HUD that received $6 million in appropriations its first year, $5 million of which went to staffing, which left $1 million for 120 employees to investigate all claims of racial discrimination in the United States. So on its face, there was no serious effort to really uproot and seriously investigate claims of racial discrimination. And we continue to have that problem, the failure to enforce the existing laws regarding civil rights. That wouldn't solve all of the problems with housing in the United States by any means, but the failure to do so, which I think is also rooted in the failure of the FHA and HUD prior to 1968 to really take its own role seriously in creating disinvestment in African American communities, and instead seeing redlining as a series of economic decisions that had nothing to do with race. And now the economic opportunities for creating homeownership among Black people are changing, and so we will change with that. But without understanding the historical role that the organizations had played in not just in issues of disinvestment, but how that translated into a popular conceptualization of Black people as irresponsible, as bad neighbors, as people to keep at bay. There was a lot of work there that needed to be undone, and HUD really failed at a critical moment when that work needed to be done.
All right, David, last thought?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of really great work happening at the local and state level. I think a lot of communities like Minneapolis, like Oregon, they're looking at issues like restrictive zoning, right? And actually making it illegal to have single-family zoning in certain communities, and actually using the language of race and discrimination as a reason for why they're doing that. So I think there's a lot of really thoughtful work happening at the local level, which I think could hopefully bubble up and inform these national conversations. And you don't hear about it enough in the debates, but all the candidates on the Democratic side actually have pretty comprehensive housing plans, right? And so I think even in a more privatized version of housing policy, if we were to create Section 8 as an entitlement program and every family that qualified received a voucher, that would make a really big difference in terms of both stabilizing communities plus providing additional access to a broader set of places. So I think I am hopeful by what I see at the local level and seeing the language actually used around some pretty innovative thinking and policy making. I think hopefully if we can leverage that to create some real community activism and continued organization, that can maybe even change some of the conversations we're having at a national level. So again, I'll end on that optimistic note and keep my fingers crossed. Things do bubble up in that way.
Well, we haven't heard a lot about housing being debated in the debates. Maybe tonight it will come up, but we certainly know that at least one presidential candidate has learned his lesson about redlining. So thank you all very much for coming out. I want to thank Liz, Keeanga, and David for being with us this evening. It's a great program. Thank you.